Hello, my name's Julian Edgar and I'm the author of this book, Do-It-Yourself Loudspeaker Building. What I want to cover in today's video is the restoration of a really interesting old pair of speakers. And when I say restoration, actually very little work was actually needed. So what were the speakers? Well, it was this pair. And it's a Danish design made by Jamo, and it's the model CBR1702. When were they made? 1980 to 82. They're made in Denmark and they are 31 kilograms for each speaker. So you can see there's a different range in the models. This is the pair that I was working on, and here they are for sale back in the early 80s. This is the lesser model, and even then in Australian dollars they were nearly $1,200 a pair. I think that the pair I was working on was something like $1,800 a pair, so very expensive for the time. Now, how did I end up with them? Well, someone was giving them away. They said some work is needed, but they were free, and my wife happened to be in the area and I got her to pick them up, and she sent me a text message saying they're huge. So I was absolutely fascinated to see what they were like when she got home. Now, this is not the pair I got. Here is a pair in perfect condition, and the ones I got were nowhere near as perfect condition, but they show the design of the speaker really well. So it's a four-way speaker, dome tweeter, dome mid-range or upper mid-range, normal cone mid-lower range, and then these 12-inch bass drivers. Now look closely because you can see a gap all the way around the bass drivers. These are actually a bass reflex enclosure, a ported enclosure, but the woofers are in the ports. The port is circumferential to the woofer. Now, that's just astonishing. I'd never seen any speaker like it before. And Jamo call it a center bass reflex, CBR design. Now, what supports the woofers in their huge ports? Well, there are rubber mounts, 1, 2, 3, 4, and they also help isolate the woofer from the surrounding cabinet. But those rubber mounts become very, very brittle when they're 40 years old, and they can fracture, and then the whole woofer just falls down inside the enclosure, and people look at it and go, oh my gosh, I've got no idea how I would fix it. And that's what had happened to the one of the pair that I got given for nothing. So here it is, looking down into it, and you can see that the bass driver is just sitting there. This ring behind it is a big metal ring that actually is normally glued to the back of the bass driver. That forms the inner part of the port. And the outer part of the port, remember the woofer sits in the port, the outer part of the port is actually formed by the front panel and an extension of the front panel of the speaker. And interestingly enough, it appears that these front speakers aren't wood or aren't plastic. They're apparently a resin and sand mix, and certainly the enclosures are incredibly heavy, as we saw a moment ago. Now, here's one of the rubber mounts that used to support the woofer. It was meant to extend outwards, and here is the back of the woofer basket, and you can see it was glued into place. The mounts were glued into place. Here's where the ring went, the big metal ring, and the glue's just got old and the rubber's just gone really hard and unworkable. And incidentally, you can also see the four-way crossover in the background there. And interestingly enough, it's not even made on a printed circuit board. It's just made on a piece of hardboard and then stuck to the back of the enclosure. These speakers, when you get inside them, are a mix of expensive and very cheap, all put together on top of each other. So here's the rusty ring that fits around the woofer sitting on the back. And here's the glue that had gone all crystalline. So I pulled the metal ring off. It's just like a section of pipe, although it has obviously been rolled just for Jamo because it's spot welded together. And I ground it back with some sanding discs, and then I've painted it with a black spray can. And then I glued it back to the back of the speaker driver again. It's actually got a recess where the ring fits in, and I used a silicone glue to glue it back in position. So here it is, the speaker sitting in its newly repainted inner port. It's a really weird way of thinking about it, isn't it? And glued into place. Now, I had to replace the rubber mounts, and I tried all sorts of different things. I ground bits of rubber and sanded them, and it just became so difficult. In the end, I went for the simplest possible solution, and that's just some sections of automotive fuel hose. Now, It sounds really, really bad, but it's got the right flexibility, it's got the right deformability, so it will fit into the recesses. And because the fuel hose is fairly stiff in compression and the two lower ones actually support the weight of the woofer, it works really, really well. Incidentally, notice Jamo's CBR, centre base reflex, the little tag down there. So here they are put together. Here's my pair of speakers, and so it's held in place. There's those 4 pieces of fuel hose that act as the rubber mounts. Here's the rest of the drivers, and up the front are 2 little pop-out potentiometer knobs that will adjust the mid-range and the treble. Now, I've oiled the wood. I didn't sand it right back. It wasn't worth it for this sort of simple restoration. So in the end, all that required was undoing this cast alloy ring, retrieving the speaker, retrieving the inner port, painting it, rubbing it back, painting it, gluing it to the back of the speaker driver again, and installing everything with the hose mounts. And it works very, very well. Now, you're all wondering, what does it sound like? Pretty good. I found a review from the early 80s and they criticised the mid-range, and I must say the mid-range does sound a little bit odd. You've got plenty of control over it though with these mid-range knobs, something like minus 10 dB you can drop it back by, and the same with the treble. But even with the mid-range adjusted, I think it still sounds a fraction odd. Like on the human voice, it just doesn't sound quite right. Bass, plenty of bass. Lovely to see a speaker, such a big speaker, 12-inch speaker with a long throw suspension and in a bass reflex enclosure. The bass driver moves only fractionally to develop good bass. Jamo claimed down to 20 hertz. When I did some quick frequency testing, I thought more like 35 hertz, but still plenty. And certainly the rigidity of the enclosure and the rigidity of that front face means you get very little resonances coming out of the enclosure woodwork and I don't know what you'd call the front panel, composite panel, I suppose. Now, where do they end up? In my lounge room? No, I've already got good speakers in my lounge room. I've already got good speakers in my home office, and so they've ended up in my workshop. So it's funny listening to this pair of very high-end 1980s speakers in the middle of my workshop. They work well in a big shed, a lot better than in a small room. And every time I look at them, I sort of grin to myself, thinking of how these were sort of the Rolls Royce of their time. If you want to read more about restoring speakers, there was supposed to be a picture there and there isn't. It's all in the book. Lots and lots of stuff, hands-on, designing, building, restoring your own speakers. Thank you.